Welcome to Monday. This is KHQN, John Birch Radio, and the New American Review with constitutional attorney Joe Wolverton and co-hosts Paul A. Jensen and Orion Marler.
Good morning, folks, and welcome to the New American Review right here on KHQN 1480. We're glad to have you with us this morning. Nice to have you, our co-host, Orion Marler.
Good morning.
And our constitutional attorney, constitutional lawyer. What's the difference, Joe? Attorney, lawyer?
In England, there's a difference, but here there's no difference.
So solicitor, our constitutional solicitor.
That's right.
We're glad to have Mr. Joe Wolverton with us and all of the knowledge he brings. And one of our first stories we're going to talk about this morning is a story you wrote last Friday. This is regarding something that is dear to all of our hearts who have a love of freedom and liberty, and that is, what is the source of our rights? Now, I think there's the possibility that our rights, according to this story, come from the United Nations. Is that true, or is there a higher source for our power, of our liberties and our freedoms? Joe?
Well, I think that, of course, we all believe that our rights are an inheritance from God, given to us as His children. As He is the King of the universe, He is empowered to give and take rights as He sees fit for our well-being. But the globalists over at the United Nations, the Secretary General, at an informal meeting of the General Assembly, or at the General Assembly on September 11th, declared that reaffirmed the United Nations support for a principle called responsibility to protect, essentially saying that if the United Nations believes that any regime in any member state is not behaving as the United Nations would have it behave, then the United Nations possesses the right to go in and alter the government of that nation. I would assume that includes the United States. And I would particularly be supported in that assumption by the fact that our ambassador, our brand new ambassadress, to the United Nations, Samantha Power, is one of the architects of this principle known as responsibility to protect, or R2P, they call it for short. Everything at the UN has to have an acronym, to make it sound cool. R2P is one of their core principles and one they're relying on to fix the mess in Syria. And, I put that in air quotes because someday you can imagine with all these crazy gun-toting wackos in the United States who go around praying and carrying guns, well, the United Nations is going to have a responsibility to protect us. And they're going to need to come in and fix the mess that is the United States. And fortunately for us, one of the chief architects of that principle is our own Samantha Power. The Ginger Ninja, I call her, by the way.
Well, we know how well that's worked in the past.
Oh, yeah.
It works so well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Ask Mali and ask Libya and Somalia, for goodness sakes.
The interesting thing is that they have all these noble principles, and they sound so noble and like that they're going to be protectors of our rights and so forth. But every time it doesn't seem to work the way they propose.
Well, I think it does work the way they propose, because in secret they propose to do away with the liberty of all nations. R2P, I want to go over. Yeah, you were being facetious. Please, don't be so facetious.
We're pretty facetious on this show anyway.
Absolutely. I want to go over these, basically what the responsibility to protect, because I don't think people talk about it enough. I don't think people talk about the threat to liberty that comes from the UN enough. It's basically the R2P, responsibility to protect, is a United Nations principle based on the proposition that sovereignty is a privilege and that privilege is given to us by the United Nations, and that if any time any nation, the government of any nation, violates the UN-approved code of conduct, then the international community is morally obligated to revoke that nation's sovereignty and assume command and control of the government of that country. It's based on three pillars, and I'll read them to you here. Number one, a state has responsibility to protect its population from atrocities.
Now, that sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
Do
for
the
state.
people well? But let's take the opposite of that corollary. Do a people have the responsibility to protect its government from committing atrocities? If
Well-
so, then we need to all rise up. We're too comfortable for that. Number two, the international community has a responsibility to assist the state if it's unable to protect its population on its own.
The
That's key.
international community.
That's right, the international community. And number three, if a state fails to protect its citizens from atrocities and all peaceful measures have failed, the international community has the responsibility to intervene through coercive measures such as economic sanctions. Military intervention is, of course, a last resort, but it is a resort. If you fail ultimately to protect your citizens from themselves, then you have a right, the United Nations has a responsibility to step in. First with economic sanctions, and as a last resort, military intervention.
And then we always know that they always agree 100% on any decision made in the United Nations. They're
Well-
always on top of it, and they agree with each other.
Well, I'll tell you one thing they do agree on. Having spent 10 days there in March while they debated the arms trade treaty, I can tell you one thing that these people at the United Nations all agree on, that the Constitution of the United States is the single remaining obstacle to the establishment of a one-world government. That is, when they think no one's listening, that is what they admit among themselves, that were they to get rid of the Constitution of the United States, the world would be a better place, would be a freer place, and the installation of a one-world government would be practically overnight. They all agree on that.
So what can we do, Mr. Wolverton? How can we protect our God-given rights against the moral principles that are being propounded or proposed by the one-world government globalists with the wearing the frock of the United Nations?
First thing everybody needs to do, call their federal senator and representative and say, vote in favor of the bill in the House and the companion bill in the Senate calling for the United Nations to remove itself from membership in the United Nations. Also calling to remove the United Nations from the United States. That's the first thing. And the most important thing, the John Birch Society's been saying it for, 50 years now? Get the U.S. out of the UN and the UN out of the U.S. If you do that, not only do we save the billions that we spend every year propping up this shadow government, but we also save a lot of American lives who've died under that blue flag in various conflicts around the world, and we protect our sovereignty from those who would take it. These people, make no mistake, genuinely believe that the Constitution is the last remaining obstacle to a one-world government. If that bothers you, call your representative and your senator. Email them every day. If that doesn't bother you, you need to get educated about why it should bother you.
Well, that's excellent. We're down almost to a break, but people need to get more educated and more involved and understand what's really behind these pushes to eclipse our freedoms and eclipse the power of our Constitution. It's going to go away if we don't do something.
Absolutely. The threat comes from inside and from outside.
All right, folks, we're up to a hard break, and we'll be back with you here on the radio live in 2 minutes, and then we'll talk to you on television. We'll continue with you. Glad to have you here on the New American Review.
And we're out.
What is the tell me a little bit more about Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. What's his background?
It's September 11th meeting. They got together to talk about Syria, of course, in advance of the fact that the UN report came out this morning saying that in 13 instances the government of Assad used chemical weapons on its own people, which, who knows? You can't tell.
And especially those after the whole world is looking at them, viewing them. Why in the world? What would be the motivation behind them?
And how can you tell? I mean, who can tell the way that civil war is going? But that's the nature of civil war, isn't it? I mean, it's the fog of war that everyone talks about. No one knows. But anyway, Ban Ki-moon gets there at the United Nations in New York on September 11th, saying that the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad, has failed to fulfill their obligations under the rule of law, and that now it's time for the United Nations to force Assad to embrace diversity. That was his key phrase, embrace diversity. And if not, then the UN will come in and enforce diversity on the government. And he specifically mentioned the principle, the UN principle known as responsibility to protect, which is what we just talked about. And over at the National Review, Stanley Kurtz even wrote an article the day after President Obama's big Syria speech that Samantha Power created.
Okay, folks, we're back with you here on the New American Review here in KHQN with our constitutional expert, Joe Wolverton, and with our co-host, Orion Marler. We were discussing the break. Let's go ahead and finish up with that, and then we'll move on to an interesting story about
Absolutely.
the separation of church and state.
Can
now,
you just call me the James Madison of my generation?
James Madison.
Well, I was about to
Can you just
say
call
the
that?
James Bond of our...
Well, either
yes.
way, I am an international man of mystery. There's little...
Well, and probably your name will be forefront, though, pretty soon.
I'm the last
Joe
of the famous
Wolverton.
international playboys.
Yes.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about Ban Ki-moon and what
Right.
and this
Well,
most recent...
at September 11th meeting, he reiterated the United Nations commitment to the responsibility to protect, this time with regard to the Syrian regime and how they have failed to fulfill their obligations under the rule of law, according to him. And President Obama, of course, had that nationally televised speech on his Syrian policy, and Stanley Kurtz at National Review said that sounded like it was written by Samantha Power because of the presence of the responsibility to protect in the speech. Always saying that there's a humanitarian need. We need to send troops in for humanitarian reason. We need to bomb Syria so the people can be freer. That makes complete sense. Peace is war, as we know in this 1984 world that we live in. Peace is war. Slavery is freedom. And Samantha Power, of course, is one of the architects of the R2P principle, and she said recently in a speech that we should be willing as Americans and as all nations to give up what she called a pinch of sovereignty for a greater amount of safety.
I recall that quote. And, of course, woe unto them that call good evil and evil good, I guess. Well, let's move on from there. Let me just state to all of our viewers and our listeners, what the issue is here is we have got the New American Review that we are using as our textbook for these shows. That's what we review. We review the New American. The New American is an online magazine and a printed magazine.
And printed, yeah.
That you can access free of charge. Go to thenewamerican.com. That's thenewamerican.com, and you can read these stories. And you can read them in entirety, plus many, many others, Joe.
Absolutely. I would suggest, though, when you go to thenewamerican.com, make sure you put the in front of it, thenewamerican.com. Subscribe, because there is a wealth of information. The magazine comes out every 2 weeks, and those articles are not reprinted online for quite some time. And the issue of the magazine coming out next contains a cover story written by me regarding the full scope of government surveillance and how we're being placed under surveillance by any number of government agencies and how they're doing it, and that won't be online. But such interesting articles as that, if I do say so myself, such gloriously well-written, amazing articles, Pulitzer-worthy. Let's just call a spade. Pulitzer-worthy. Beyond Pulitzer. Maybe even Nobel Prize-worthy articles on The New American. Just subscribe to it. It's very inexpensive.
Now,
and
Joe
it's
is
worth
one of
everything.
the authors of that great publication, and that is available both online as well as printed. Now,
right.
You're going to want to subscribe if you want to really know what's going on in our government, in our nation, in our world. Of course, this is the New American Review, but we cover world affairs, world affairs issues as well.
And that's one of the things that I think, Paul, is that people, whenever I go give these speeches, people are saying, well, how can I get more informed? I want to know more about this, so when people talk about it, I sound more informed. The thing I tell them is two things. Number one, go to thenewamerican.com. Every day, there's about 12 to 15 new articles on there of things that people are talking about. And subscribe to the magazine so that you can really have something in your hands to help get you up to speed on some of these issues that are affecting our freedom. Every day, the threat to freedom grows darker and darker. And it's mostly because good people are not doing what they should be doing, and that is educating themselves, and once they've been warned, warning their neighbor.
Well, and I've taken the printed copy for many, many years, and I can tell you that it was it was prophetic. Things we read 10 and 15 and 20 years ago are now that were even touted as negative. I mean, many people saying, "Oh, this is ridiculous" and so forth. But now have ended up being absolutely factual, and full of truth. And that's what you can say about the New American Review. You're going to get truth.
Well, we try to get to the bottom of things, the story behind the story, which we pride ourselves on that.
Well, and that brings up another truth and another problem. And we're going to talk first about the story, Joe, and then let's hear a little bit about the philosophy.
Sure.
The USDA, the United States Dairy Association of all people,
Department of Agriculture.
Department of Agriculture, they said they say that the Florida Food Pantry must remove. Now, they are a Christian organization.
It's the Christian Service Center in Lake City, Florida.
Have stated that they must remove any Christian symbols. That's interesting to tell a church that it has to remove its Christian symbols. Tell us a little bit about this story, Joe.
The Christian Service Center in Lake City, Florida, is a food kitchen. They give out meals to those who are less fortunate. They are literally doing the work of the Lord on the earth, handing out, feeding those who are hungry, clothing those who are naked. And what they do is, whenever they give out a meal, they would hand out one of the little Bibles. You've seen the little Bibles that people give out for free. They would give out a little Bible, and they would give out a meal, and they would ask the person if they would like to pray, and if they'd like to hear a short message about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, the Department of Agriculture hears about this and tells them, you're no longer going to get any food supplies from the Department of Agriculture unless you remove all references to Jesus Christ, quit handing out Bibles, and take down the pictures of Jesus inside the pantry, and take down the Ten Commandments monument as well. And unless they do that, they will no longer receive any subsidies from the USDA, any food subsidies from the USDA. And to their credit, Kay Daly, the executive director of the CSC, the Christian Service Center, said, then I guess we won't be taking any food from the government. Which I applaud her. She's not of my faith, but she is an example of a good disciple of Jesus Christ, someone who's doing good work every day, and someone who recognizes that when there's a threat to liberty, you stand up in defense of liberty, especially in defense of the liberty which is known as, the freedom to practice one's religion.
She also said that if the Savior could feed the 5,000 with a few loaves of bread and 5 fishes, or 5 loaves of bread and a few fishes,
absolutely,
he says we'll be able to get the food in here to feed those
people. And it has happened. Others have stepped up.
Such a great thing. In a way, it's a positive thing that the USDA came in there and said, hey, we're not going to give you any food anymore because you're promoting the gospel of Jesus Christ. In a way, it's a good thing because now local churches have stepped up, individuals have stepped up and brought food much more than the USDA ever brought. These individuals and these churches in Lake City are making up the difference in a glorious way, in a way that we all should commend. I mean, we should have that place flooded with calls congratulating them for what they've done, not only in the name of liberty, but in the name of Christian kindness. Tell them we support you. And boy, if you have an extra $1 or $2, why not help them out and help out your local
there you go.
food pantry as
now,
well?
what should be the source of welfare? Should it be the government? Should government be involved in feeding people, or should that be an individual, a family, and a church responsibility? They've usurped that responsibility,
Absolutely.
and with it come the ties that control.
I'll tell you, I teach, as you've noted before, I teach a class on the American government. And one of the things we talk about is legal plunder. If it's illegal for me to do to you, it's illegal for the government to do to you. I can't go to you, Paul, and take money out of your wallet and go give it to any humanitarian cause that I think is worthy. I can't do that. That's called stealing. Well, if it's stealing for an individual to do, then it's still stealing for a government to do.
Because they derive their powers from the people.
That's right.
So if Farmer Jones has 2 cows and Farmer Smith has none, Farmer Smith can't take one of Farmer Jones' cows without facing criminal charges. But
that's
the
right.
government does it every day.
No matter how noble the cause.
That's communism.
Well, yes, and it's the beginnings of communism, absolutely. And it's known as legal plunder, and I want everyone listening to this to get fired up and make sure our government knows that we know what they're doing. They are stealing. They are doing to us what we would be thrown in jail for doing to each other.
And now they're actually openly calling it redistribution of wealth. When I was young, that was a terrible phrase, but now I've heard the president use it, redistribution of our wealth.
Absolutely.
Take from those who earn and work and give it to those who are idle and don't produce.
Taking property from a man to whom it does belong and giving it to someone to whom it does not rightly belong. That is the very definition of plunder, and the only reason it's legal when the government does it is because they say it is, and we don't call them on it. Absolutely. And in this case, of course, perhaps the worst thing about this case that we're talking about is the notion that there is some separation of church and state, which requires that anyone receiving any sort of government assistance must completely abolish any reference to religion in some warped notion of how the First Amendment is meant to apply.
Now, there's a story inside the story in the New American that talks about an Indiana food pantry that was also facing the loss of its USDA food privileges. What happened there, Joe?
Well, they did lose their privileges, and they agreed. They finally made, I guess you'd say, a compromise with the government and said, we'll wait till everyone gets their food, and then we'll ask them if they would like to pray.
So the issue was over. They were praying for these people and praying on the food before they were served the food.
Right.
And there was a public outcry, and as long as they agreed not to pray till after the people got their food, it's kind of convoluted to me.
It's ridiculous, and it just shows that the government will do anything it can, that which is within their power and that which exceeds their power, to completely abolish religion from the public sphere and to marginalize those who dare claim belief in Jesus Christ.
So during the break, and we only got 30 seconds, we'll discuss a little bit more about what is the separation of church and state.
Absolutely.
What does that mean? I'd like, and those on the radio I'm sure would like to hear that as well. We're down to a hard break. And we'll be back with you in 3 minutes after this word from our sponsors. Glad to have you here on the New American Review on KHQN 1480. Okay, Joe, what does this mean? What is the separation of church and state? How did this all come about? What's the history of this? And is there supposed to be a separation of church and state? Is that what was meant by the Founding Fathers?
Well, yes, in a way, but I mean the phrase "the separation of church and state," of course, comes from a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptists. Connecticut had an established religion, a congregational religion, and the Baptists were being oppressed. And the Baptists wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson saying, "What can we do about this?" And Thomas Jefferson said, "Well, I hope that the legislature of Connecticut will begin to permit the free exercise of religion and establish a wall of separation between church and state." Now, what he was talking about, of course, is completely complying with the Constitution. That is eradicating an established religion, because in I think 8 of the 13 colonies originally had established religions. They had state-funded religion, right? And those who weren't members of those religions were still forced to pay for the preachers and the buildings and that sort of thing. And of course, our founding fathers, principally among them Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, knew that you're actually constricting freedom when you make an established religion. So they said, let's have two prongs. Number one, the government cannot establish a religion. Number two, the government cannot infringe on one's right to freely exercise his own religion. That's the two prongs. No established religion, that is to say, no government established religion, no state church, and everyone must be permitted to freely exercise his religion. That's it. That's the scope of the First Amendment. That's what the First Amendment means. Well, as far as the religious part, that's what it means. Don't have a state church. Don't infringe upon people's right to practice a religion. And, you know, in the last couple of years, President Obama and the Obama administration have subtly changed the right to freely exercise to the right of worship, which is an entirely different thing, right? Worshiping is one thing. Freely exercising your religion is quite another. But as they so often do, they try to shrink the scope of the right to fit their definition. And people don't notice it. People don't pay attention. I mean, I've been writing about that for, I guess the first time I wrote about it was 2010, when President Obama and Hillary Clinton began mentioning freedom of worship. There's no freedom of worship in the Constitution.
Welcome back to the New American Review here on KHQN. We're glad to have you with us today. You know, we forgot last week and we forgot this week. If you have any questions or comments for our expert legal attorney, our constitutional attorney,
or for Orion,
or for Orion, you can call us here toll free at 1-800-776
waiting for you to call
1913. That's 1-800-776-1913. During the break, what is really the separation of church and state, and we'll allow you to go to our archives on Facebook or on Google Hangouts or on YouTube. Those are where all of our archives are found, and this show is being broadcast to you live. And to access that, of course, you go to utahtalkradio.com, and you can push to listen live. And when you push on that, when you click on that link, it takes you right to the archives, and you can listen and watch the entire program and anything that we talked about during the breaks.
Great.
So let's talk about a new topic now, because we always seem to run out of time in these things. And again, on Friday, there was a story in the New American. And if you want to look at the story and read it while we talk about it, it's thenewamerican.com. And it's a story entitled, House Republicans Pass a Bill Delaying Obamacare Subsidies. What is that story about, and what does that actually mean? What are the House Republicans trying to do? I think that the Senate kind of has control. The Democrats have control of the Senate. The Republicans have control currently of the House. And so they passed this bill that they're saying was an exercise in futility and just to get attention and so forth.
Well, I mean, you're right that it's an exercise in futility. There's no chance that this passes the Senate because the Senate's in control of not only, this is the problem I have. We often talk of the Republicans did this and it was so good, and then the Democrats blocked it. Or the Democrats did something so bad and the Republicans saved the Republic. Let's dispense with all of that, because that is not true. There may have been a time when that was true, when the Republicans equaled constitutionalists and Democrats didn't. But in the day we live in, there are only two parties. There's the party of war and power and the party of peace. And we've got this party that happen to be mostly Republicans who passed a bill in the House of Representatives saying that before anybody receives their Obamacare subsidy, that is to say, under Obamacare, if you are below a certain threshold of income, then you get subsidy from the government to buy health care insurance from approved health care providers, of course, meaning agents of the federal government. So you come in, you only have so much income, and they give you subsidies to buy your medical insurance. Now, the problem is there's no verification of the income. It's the honor system. You go into your local navigator, is what they call them in your state. The person does sort you out with regard to Obamacare and what you're eligible for. Tell them how much you make, and if you make below a certain limit, then you get the government helping you pay for medical insurance. Now, some of the Republicans, joined by 5 Democrats, voted for a bill on last Thursday saying that before anybody receives these subsidies to purchase their medical care insurance, they should have to verify their income by Social Security statement or an income tax return or something like that before they get any subsidies. Because as it is right now, you'll get your subsidy, and then later on down the road somewhere, the government will check it out. But by that time, we've already been robbed, right? That's the government saying, as it always does, I'm going to come in, I'm going to steal a bunch of money out of your wallet, and later on, if I find out it was wrong, I promise I'll give it back to you.
And by the way, one of those Blue Dog Democrats that voted with the Republicans was our own here in Utah, Jim Matheson.
Our own Jim Matheson. Yeah, I mean, there is so much fraud and abuse in the Obamacare system that it baffles my mind literally every day that I don't hear somewhere that the switchboard of the White House, the switchboard of Congress, is not flooded with calls. It boggles my mind, Orion, that in Utah, supposedly one of the most Republican states, that in Nevada, that in Texas, that in Virginia, that the state legislatures have completely abdicated their role as the final protection of freedom and have gone along. I sat in Salt Lake City testifying at the committee of the Senate regarding Obamacare and how it was unconstitutional, and heard those Republican state senators say, too late, we've lost the fight, we're going to go ahead and participate. Our governor, chief among them. But it's nationwide, Orion and Paul. Nationwide, these state legislators have completely abandoned the responsibility they have to protect citizens of their states from unconstitutional federal acts, and Obamacare is the worst of them. It will rob us blind. It will take away the incentive that good doctors have to practice medicine, and it will encourage fraud from the bottom to the top. We will become the third world country that the United Nations and the establishment wants us to become. And this bill it's a drop in the ocean. It is literally a thimble in the ocean of fraud. But it's something. It's saying, hey, before we have all the American people pay for your medical care, your health insurance, let's at least verify that you qualify. But President Obama and his ilk say, nope, hands off. We're going to take their word for how much they make, and we're going to go ahead and take that money from Paul and from Joe and from Orion, and we're going to give it to these people regardless if they qualify or not.
So what's the reason behind the real reason behind their willingness to do this? What are they really trying to accomplish?
The Republicans who sponsored the bill?
No, the administration who don't think it's a good thing to do to check. I mean, literally, if you walked into a service station, as this story says, yeah, and we say, you know what, I don't have any money right now, but I'll tell you what, on the honor system, why don't you go ahead and give me gas and groceries, and at some point in time, if I owe it to you in the future, I will pay it back.
I'm going to go ahead and try that today. I got to get some gas today.
Yeah, let's go see if we can get that.
I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now, the point is as is the point with all of this stuff, the government, and when I say the government, hey, we get the government we deserve, Paul. Well, these people are elected by us, right? The government is trying to make every American dependent upon the government so that they can create an atmosphere where you might love your freedom, but the only place to get any sort of stability, financial stability, will be from the government. They can do it with health care. They can do it with housing now, right? How many people in this country, how many elderly people rely on their Social Security checks every month to survive?
Number one.
Absolutely, they do. Why? We point to the government, Paul, and we say it's the government's fault. They're impoverishing us. No, sir. We are impoverishing ourselves. Why are our families and our churches not stepping up and stepping into the breach and filling in for these people? We need to force the government out of this thing by two ways. Number one, stepping up, fulfilling our duties as Christians and as brothers and sisters to each other. And number two, by having these state legislatures filled with people who get it, with people who are determined to draw. You talk about a red line of President Obama. Let's draw a red line. And that red line is the Constitution. You are allowed this much power. If you exceed it, every act exceeding that power is null, void, and of no legal effect. You can make laws all day, and unless they're constitutional, they will not be obeyed.
One of the problems that I've seen is working with communists, as I did, was the people get to the point where they don't care how miserable they are as long as everyone else is in the same boat.
That's a very good point. I saw that myself growing up. It's in East Germany. I mean, it was the same thing. Everybody, was miserable, so no one knew how miserable they were, right?
Well, I was in the grocery store line the other day, and there was a young man in front of me, and he got up and he had a credit card, and it was a food stamp credit card. Mm-hmm. And he says, I should have applied for this a long time ago. And then he looked back in the line of 6 or 8 of us and says, do you guys have one of these food stamp cards? Everybody ought to have one of these. Everybody ought to have one of these. This is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And that is the mentality of so many people in our nation. Get what you can. There's no integrity at all anymore.
Look, and that's the thing. It's not government's fault at the end of the day. It's our own fault.
For allowing
because we not only allow it by electing and re-electing people who will do this, which, remember, is nothing more than stealing. Because if it's stealing for me to do to you, it's stealing if the government does it to you. And number two, it's our own fault for taking advantage. Well, if the money's there, I might as well use it. Right? That's the say.
Everyone else does.
I've heard that over and over, even from conservatives. Well, the money's there. I've paid my taxes all these years. I might as well use it. No, you might as well not. Let's make it where we don't need this. Let's step into the breach and take care of people. But we won't, because the cable's still on, the electricity works, still got gas in my car, I'm comfy, it's bread and circuses. Let the world spin on, I'll be fine. And then, of course, you have the faction of the religious conservative movement, of which I consider myself a member, who say, well, we don't really need to do anything because Jesus will be back soon and he'll take care of everything. I mean, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, and I hear it from the pulpit in church today. Well, we don't need to worry about this kind of stuff. It's all depressing. Besides, Jesus will be back soon. Well, that's what I'm going to do about my yard this summer. I'm not going to mow it. Jesus will be back soon. It'll all be burned anyway. I'm not going to mow my grass.
Well, we're glad to have you with us today on the New American Review here on KHQN. We are originating this broadcast from Provo, Utah.
From the moon.
From the moon and Provo, Utah, throughout the world on streaming here on KHQN 1480. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
You've got a lot of tongue-in-cheek in your presentation today, Joe.
Do I?
A lot of tongue-in-cheek. That's good.
Keep my tongue firmly planted in my cheek.
But that's what the Russians told me, though. If you, they don't care how miserable they are, as long as everybody's the same. And if one had a successful garden in the middle of the night, the neighbors would come and trample it down.
Absolutely.
Because they wouldn't let anybody be better than they were.
Oh, absolutely.
But the problem, the money runs out.
Well,
the money runs out, then everybody gets miserable, just like he was talking about.
Right, and that's what we talked about last week, was that, the big, nothing's going to happen here until the checks start bouncing. As long as your food stamp card works, as long as you get your check every 1st and 15th or whatever, whenever they come out, Everything's fine. The moment those checks stop coming, though, you're going to have a revolution, and it's not going to be from people like you and me. It's going to be from the people receiving government subsidy. You'll have a different sort of revolution than you ever imagined. You'll have a Russian revolution as opposed to an American revolution.
Well, when you pay somebody a welfare check, you take care of them really well, and then they know that they're a welfare recipient. Well, once you cut it off, then they hate you.
Well, and
they hate the person that's been giving them the check.
Absolutely, and it's also a thing of, one thing I teach in my class that I teach on the Constitution is that one of the primary ways that the establishment keeps people on the dole is to make it not to unattach the stigma to receiving welfare. If there's no stigma, if everybody receives it, there's no stigma to it. And that's one of their best tactics, is remove the stigma.
That's why they went to the card, because
5,
if you show
4,
food stamps,
3.
it shows.
Quando sono solo sognar orizzonte mancan le parole. Sì, lo so che non c'è luce in una stanza.
What a variety of lead-in music.
What happened to our AC/DC bumper music,
I don't
engineer?
know. Jonathan,
What happened to the AC/DC
switching
bumper?
things up.
I mean, we go from AC/DC to what? Hey, I'm awake. I'm awake, everybody.
I think you ought to play one of my songs for the intro.
One of you have some songs?
Bring
it.
Yeah.
He used to be he had a wonderful band, well-known band back in
the Sandy Hill Singers.
The Sandy Hill Singers. Good morning, Provo.
I got a copy of his CD.
This morning, the Sandy Hill Singers featuring Ori and Marla.
We're glad to have you back here in Provo, Utah. We're originating this broadcast throughout the world.
And the moon.
And we get a lot of people who contact us over in the East Coast. Quite surprising. We're glad to have you all with us. And we're talking about some things today. This is a continuation of the previous segment, and this one is entitled, a story in the New American Review entitled, House GOP Leadership Thwarted by Tea Party Conservatives Over Defunding Obamacare. Now, in the previous story, we didn't talk about just defunding Obamacare in its entirety. It was a discussion about just the overages, just the subsidies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this one is the GOP House leadership were trying to get a House bill passed by House Majority Leader Eric Cantor. Is he actually a conservative? Is he a Republican? He's not even a rhino, is he? I mean, he's just he's a very, very liberal individual who is obviously a globalist.
Absolutely.
But when it was obvious that this bill was going to be defeated, and what was the bill? And also, we have our own Jason Chaffetz here in Utah who called this bill and the pulling of the bill hocus pocus and to chancery by Senator Ted Cruz. What is the bill that we're talking about, and what was it the attempt? What was it trying to accomplish?
Well, it was basically a pair of bills. One that would have defunded Obamacare, and one that would have kept the government running through the middle of December. Now, what was going to happen to that? Obviously, and this is why Jason Chaffetz and Ted Cruz and other people who understand the Constitution called it a trick and hocus pocus and chicanery and every other synonym you can think of. Because what was going to happen is that senators were going to have to vote. They were going to have two opportunities. One, they could vote down the running of the government, and it would be tied to defunding Obamacare. So they were obviously going to have to vote to oppose Obamacare and to keep it alive, which would be political suicide, obviously, because everyone in this country hates Obamacare, except for the president. Now, the better idea is Ted Cruz's idea, is to say, all right, let's pass an omnibus bill that funds the government, all except Obamacare. The entire government, all the things you people want, we're going to give you, except Obamacare. Now, what do you think would happen there?
Well, of course, it would go to the Senate and be defeated.
Yes, it would.
And then it would go to the president, even if it was passed in the Senate, and it would be vetoed by the president. But where would the responsibility lie?
That's the question, and that's what Ted Cruz understands is where would the responsibility lie for not only making the government bankrupt and run out of money for all these people that they love to subsidize, but for they would be doing it in the, what would they be saying? It's more important to us to preserve and protect and defend Obamacare than preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution as we swore to do when we were elected to office. And of course, that would be a brilliant move. But it's not going to happen because too many in the establishment are there not just to play politics. They're just there to pad their own pockets and to play politics and to have something to say during re-election, whereas Ted Cruz, Jason Chaffetz, and others are interested in truly saving this nation from the millstone that will be Obamacare.
Well, as far as the Congress and the Senate, they have to use this Obamacare too, right?
No, they do not. No, they are exempt from following their own laws. Of course, we've discussed this before. If you or I sent money to Al-Qaeda, we'd be indefinitely detained in a federal prison. If the Congress sends money to Al-Qaeda, they're praised as humanitarians and as peacekeepers and liberty lovers, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, we've got, as we see there on the screen, you've got our own Mike Lee and Ted Cruz and Rand Paul in the Senate. Those are the three musketeers there that are trying to do what they can to pull this country in some small way back toward its constitutional foundation. And thank heaven for them, for trying. And we're going to try to get them on the show, actually, to talk a little bit about what they're doing and the purpose for, what's behind their purpose. Why are they so different? Why do we finally have these people in the Senate that are trying to do what they can to preserve the Constitution?
Let me ask you, Joe, why would not the Republican leadership want to propose the Ted Cruz option of we will fund a budget for the United States, but we will eliminate Obamacare from being funded? Why would not the Republican leadership want to go along with that? Because it even if they are playing politics, it exposes their real hand, exposes their hand of what they want, and then it takes it away from being a Republican problem to being a Democratic issue that they defunded government. They went ahead and went along with the Obamacare. Well, everyone, 79% was the last number I heard of American citizens that are against Obamacare.
It's politics. I mean, if Cantor's bill were to be passed in the Senate, and the senators would be forced, the sitting senators would be forced to vote to defund Obamacare in that way, then yes, you'd probably have more Republicans in the Senate come 2014. Yes, you'd probably have more. But what type of Republican? Why does it matter? You're going to have a Republican who's against Obamacare, but who has to play politics with Cantor and his ilk and allow the government to continue to grow at the pace it's growing. And when you say government is growing, it's growing because it's killing us. Yeah. It's like a zombie. The government's like a zombie. It's a zombie that grows more powerful as it consumes our wealth and prosperity. And of course, this makes it difficult for, we were talking about the Tea Party. It makes it difficult for members of people who consider themselves Tea Party. Are you going to stand up and say, absolutely defund Obamacare, but fund the rest of the government in the name of politics, in the name of getting Republicans elected? Or are you going to follow the example set by Ted Cruz and say, no, let's go ahead and make people decide? Do you care more about supporting and funding Obamacare than you care about supporting all of these myriad social programs? Let's make it where you have to stand up and be counted. But people hate that nowadays. People hate being counted and standing up.
Well, in the 2014 midterm election, with 21 of 35 Democratic seats up for grabs. How important would this be to try to maybe change the leadership in the Senate as well? How can that be done? What can we do to expose these people for who they are? Of course, the Democrats are no different. Who said there's not a dime's worth of difference between either party?
No, I don't know. I did.
And that was you?
I created
okay,
that. No, it's the responsibility lies with us, of course, to find people that have a record of being constitutionally sound and demonstrating that they will be bound by the Constitution. That no matter how noble or how humanitarian something may be, if they are not specifically granted that power in the Constitution, that they will not do it. That was the legacy of Ron Paul, right? They called him Dr. No because he voted no on any bill that contained a provision that granted or assumed power that was not given the Congress in the Constitution. So he earned the nickname Dr. No. I would welcome that. We need people like that who are going to refuse to vote in favor of any of these acts of the federal government that are going to bankrupt us morally and economically.
And thank heavens for gridlock.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Our founding fathers wanted gridlock. They wanted the government to be tied up and be unable to sit there. And of course, they didn't want a full-time Congress either, did they? They wanted citizen representatives, people who are working 9 months out of the year and 3 months out of the year, go to Washington, take care of necessary business. But now, Washington's a full-time job. Being a representative is a full-time job. Not only that, it's the best entree to a bigger, better-paying full-time job when you get out.
And retirement, you bet.
Absolutely, and a great retirement program. And you don't have to participate in the Obamacare fraud. You get to actually have your own health insurance. You know what a racket that is. Orion, you should run for Congress.
Well, I probably could. I could
absolutely.
I could vacillate either way.
Absolutely.
Whatever the way the wind blows, that makes the most money
Let's do it.
and pleases the most congressmen and senators.
But, remember, let's not forget that the primary way, the best way to fight this whole thing is not to worry so much about Washington. Frankly, we'd all be better off if the government was left bankrupt, did not receive its funds, and returned to the swamp that it won. Whose ever idea it was to drain that swamp, yeah, we need to have a talk on the other side. But I think the best way is just to make sure we make strong states. Get the states back to being strong.
And nullification and power.
Nullify this stuff. If you don't know what nullification is, please go to thenewamerican.com and type in my last name and the word nullification in the search bar. Read the hundreds of articles I've written on it and really get up to speed, and let's return this country to its constitutional foundations.
I couldn't run, though. I can't lie.
Oh, well.
I cannot tell a lie, so I couldn't run.
You in Washington. Well, we're glad that you've joined us today on the New American Review here on KHQN 1480.